good. We're going to go. Fine. We're ready now. In the meantime, as we do this introduction, you'll notice that we have a very famous person from the past bringing in a very special flag to the front of this meeting, this gathering. I love it when George Washington gets it. Thank you. And yes, it's true. The FBI called this flag subversive. Just like our Gadsden flag, too, by the way. Appeal to heaven. And then sometimes it works like it did in November 5th. So, well, we have actually, I don't have to remind you because we're on a really good winning streak, but we've had people in the past that have done a really great job fighting the good fight against overwhelming odds and actually have won with determination and resolve. And sometimes it kind of like it avalanches. You get on a roll and then all of a sudden you break through all these barriers that seem to be impossible to break. Well, our next speaker is one of those warriors that broke through barriers and enacted and somehow made a miracle in his city that was a doomed city and revitalized it. And he did it with resolve, and he got friends as his momentum was carrying forward. So I'm proud to introduce to you Ken Peterson, miracle worker.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate that. You know, I saw George Washington here. There was a TV game show, and they were asking the contestants who was the third president. And the time clock was going, and the person couldn't get an answer. The buzzer went off. They said, "Why didn't you know who the third president was?" He said, "I just need a little more time." You figured George Washington was the first one, and he's on the $1 bill. Thomas Jefferson is the second president, he's on the $2 bill. I didn't know who was on the $3 bill. He got, before you raise your hand, he got that wrong because Thomas Jefferson was not the second president. But you can see where they were going with it. So I don't know who's on the $3 bill, but George, thank you for everything you did to get us started 2 years ago.
Bill Clinton is the $3 bill.
Who's that? All right, well, thanks very much. When I got the phone call, where's Bob Keeler? Is he here? Yeah, Bob gave me a call and he said, "Ken, do you believe in free speech?" I said, "Well, of course I do." So I'll be giving a speech for free today. I should have seen that coming. I should have seen that coming. But I do see a lot of familiar faces out there. Thank you for coming today and listening. I really appreciate it. But you know what else I see out here? I see never quit. Never give up, never give in, never surrender, and look where we are. It's just amazing that you guys have kept the faith through the years. Anybody here believe in miracles? Oh man, after November 5th, if you don't, I don't know where you've been. But you know, through that campaign, Trump's rallies were very crowded, so Hunter Biden wanted to go find out what all the fuss was about. So Hunter went to one of Trump's rallies, and of course it was very crowded. And he ended up bumping into Trump. And when Trump turned around, Hunter said, "Oh, pardon me." No? All right, I don't use that one anymore. But now the election, the politicking is over. Elections are over. Now you get to govern. I don't know which is harder, campaigning or governing. My speech today, I took a quick peek at the logo for the Virginia Tea Party, and one of the three things mentioned there is economic freedom. Economic freedom. So I'm going to talk about economic freedom, how do you get it, what it is, how does government either give it to you or take it away, and the other thing is, how do you govern? Once they gave you the torch, what do you do now? What are good policies? What are good procedures to follow when you're governing? And I know a little bit about that having served at Goodson County. Don't you hate it when Hollywood actors and sports athletes weigh in on politics? So I'm not a Hollywood actor, And I'm not a professional athlete, but I'm going to weigh in on economics because I do have a master's degree in economics from the Northwestern School, the Kellogg School. And I'm going to weigh in on how to govern because I served 3 terms on the Board of Supervisors of Goodson County. And it turns out if you get the economy right, if you nail the economy, the election victories follow. So when I was first elected, we nailed the economy, and I was re-elected to 2 consecutive terms after that with 99% of the vote. So the elections do take care of themselves if you get the economy right. So we'll talk about the economy and then how to govern. You've all heard the term, it's the economy stupid. Right? It turns out it really is the economy, and that's at least in part what happened on November 5th, right? Economic dissatisfaction, turnover. So enough about my speak. Let's just jump right in here. Now, you don't need to take a whole lot of notes because I did all the work for you and wrote everything down. All the answers are in my 2 books here. That's a shameless plug. But it's all in here. These are good resources if you want to talk to somebody about what is good government and why. Now, you remember President Reagan? Anybody? Some of my jokes don't get applause, but every time I mention his name, I get applause. But when Reagan asked Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, that was widely assumed to be the final victory of freedom and capitalism over socialism and communism. That was finally settled. Right, settled science. But what it did, in fact, was trigger something else. And try to stay with me on this. When they asked me to speak, I said, as long as it's not first thing after lunch, because people are full, and as long as you don't dim the lights, and as long as you don't turn the heat up, and as long as I can talk about something besides economics. And they said, well, we need a really strong presenter to pull that off, so that's why we got you slotted there. I don't know if that was, so follow me with this. When that Berlin Wall came down, and by the way, I served on the border with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I'm a West Point graduate, former paratrooper, and served some time on the border. And I got a chance to see how capitalism worked in West Germany and how socialism and communism worked in East Germany. And I will tell you, it was dramatically different. So, all right, so stay with me for this. When that wall came down and America won the Cold War, China and Russia took a peek at that and said, in order for us to have enough economic activity to generate enough tax revenue to fund a sufficiently strong military that could be projected around the world and displace the United States as the world's #1 superpower, we need to emulate their economic system and adopt capitalism. That was a lesson takeaway from how we lost the Cold War. Well, socialism and communism didn't work, it failed, but capitalism did. Well, so then let's become capitalists. Now, before any hands go up, they're maintaining the form of government, which would be a socialist dictator form of government. But the economic system on how they generate economic activity and generate tax dollars to fund their military, they saw that the free market capitalism society we have here in America was a superior way to generate that wealth to be able to project your power. Everybody with me on that? I'll go over one more time if we need to, but I think you're all there. All right? So then, now, it turns out that if you get to retain the fruits of your labor and ideas, that provides an economic incentive for you to create prosperity that socialism and communism don't have, because you don't get to keep the fruits of your labor and activity and ideas. That's the missing incentive part, and they realized that and said, okay, we've got to do that. Because if you don't have economic prosperity, what happens? Both Russia and China in their history, you guys know their history, went through violent revolutions, right? Ask Tsar Nicholas II and his family in Russia, and then of course Mao over in China. So they both learned from that history that no violent revolution ever started because people are too free and too prosperous. So they decided if we can generate economic prosperity, then maybe we won't go through that same thing, but they didn't want to give up the freedom side. So they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, both sides. Economic activity, capitalism, and When the wall came down, what lesson did we learn? The United States decided that we would be the only world superpower so that we had less of a need for military might and started redirecting funds from our military, and they called it a peace dividend. Anybody hear that term, peace dividend? All right, so we're the only world superpower. Let's take the money and do something else with it. Well, what did we do with it? We began diverting resources away from the military and began providing dramatically expanded social programs. So the net result of the wall coming down was the three major world superpowers, for some reason, all decided to start to abandon their founding core principles and adopt those of their adversary. You still with me on that? So capitalism America decides to start drifting towards socialism, and Russia and China, socialism, communism next year starts drifting toward capitalism. Now, what's the evidence of that? You hear people talk all the time. Evidence of China and Russia embracing capitalism. Today, there are dozens of entrepreneurial billionaires in Russia and China, in all kinds of industries, high-tech industries, casinos, energy. Where in Marxism does it say that some people should be billionaires and others shouldn't? It doesn't. What else? They establish stock markets. Do you know that Russia and China have multiple stock markets, 3, 4, 5 different stock markets, to give you access to the capital markets, capitalism markets. Get this? So they're accessing the capital market, doing IPOs. A number of their issues are traded on the New York Stock Exchange here in America, and they're accessing capital through us. They've also allowed private ownership of the means of production. Where is that in Marxism? So these are examples of what China and Russia have been doing since the Berlin Wall came down. I can't really fault them because I think capitalism is a superior way to go, but this is evidence that they're doing that transition to try and generate enough economic activity to be able to project their power on the world stage. So what have we been doing in America? Drifting towards socialism. The evidence is in a variety of social programs that we have, the so-called entitlement programs. I don't need to list them all, but Medicaid, unemployment benefits, subsidized housing, subsidized health care, subsidized child care, the list goes on and on. You know the list as well as I do. And those programs are put in place, the transfers of wealth are put in place to try to provide more equal outcomes based on the needs of people and their value to society as perceived by the government, right? Does that sound a little bit like Marxism? These are just things that we're doing here in our country, and I just want to make sure that everybody's still going along here. So now I understand why number 2 and number 3 want to be number 1. But why would number 1 want to be number 2 or 3? And yet we're both abandoning our founding principles. They're abandoning Marxism, we're abandoning free market capitalism, and moving toward each other. Now I refer to that in my second book as superpower cross currents. That's where the superpowers are crossing each other in the night. So as we're drifting, I sometimes worry about this country. Do you guys worry about this country? Our future at all? A little bit? All right, good. I'm in the right place then. I boarded the right plane. All right, an example. There was another TV show. Comedian set up a table and chairs in the middle of New York City. And as people passed by, he had a big sign behind him that said, "End women's suffrage." And collected thousands of signatures. Oh, that's horrible. I didn't know there was women's suffrage. Thousands of signatures. They had no idea that that's the 19th Amendment of the Constitution, gave women the right to vote in 1920. They had no idea. So I worried. I went to a bank the other day and I cashed a check and I said, "No large bills." And they said, "Don't worry, sir, we checked, they're all the same size." So I worry sometimes the education is not going to, we got social media, we got social this one, we don't have social studies. We don't have the history, American history. All right, now let's shift gears a little bit and we'll talk about good government policies and bad government policies. One of the bad government policies, in my mind, let's close the churches during COVID because it's a place where a large number of people will gather. Well, let's keep the casinos open. The churches were deemed non-essential. Casinos were deemed essential. And yet they're both large places for people to gather. Alcoholics Anonymous were not allowed to meet in small groups. But the ABC stores stayed open as essential.
What's wrong with that?
Tobacco Anonymous could not meet. The tobacco stores were deemed essential and stayed open. Are you following me? Like, I don't get all this, but this is just what actually happened, right? We're counting history here. So I think those are generally kind of inconsistent, if not bad, government policy. So what are good policies? What should they be doing instead of all that? Let's start with tax policy. Okay. Thanks, Mom. Let's start with tax policy. A good policy is to tax what you want less of and subsidize through taxes what you want more of. Right? You follow me on that? So I'll give you an example. Here's an example. I have to bring it home with an example. Let's say you're coming down here today on I-95 or I-64, and you weren't paying attention, and the police pull you over. You were speeding. Okay? What do? They give you a ticket, right? And what happens then? You got to pay money, right? Well, that's a tax on speeding because we want less of it. Now, take another picture of that and say the cop pulls you over and goes, "You were speeding. Here's $100 in cash." You do more. So you get the concept of if I subsidize it, we get more of it. If I punish it, we get less of it. Well, it's that way for everything. And so what, as a country, do we tax? Because that's what we want less of. Hard work, success.
Overtime.
So we want less success, less. What do we subsidize?
Free stuff.
Unemployment, poverty, drug use. Do we have more of that now? And we are subsidizing, right? You see, I mean, these dots aren't that far apart, right? You can connect all this. So good tax policy. As a little bit of an aside, as you know, I served on the Brewster County Board of Supervisors, and one of my last things I did after my third term, by the way, I voluntarily imposed term limits, no more than 12 years. And one of my last acts, I made a motion that we pass the largest tax cut in the history of the county, 200-year history. The largest tax cut. I made the motion. It was not easy. It was a tough fight. Just went 3-2, just barely squeaked by. But thanks to Susan LaScalette, who voted with me on that board, she was one of the 3 in favor of that. We managed to get the largest tax cut in the history of the county through on Brewster County. Because it's not the county's money, it's the people's money. And where you have a little extra, you can give it back. By the way, our tax rate currently is about 20 to 25% lower than any of our neighbors or any in Central Virginia to begin with. And we just decided we were still running a surplus, so, and we pay for 80% of our schools. Our composite index is 0.8. The average for the state of Virginia is, local share is 45%. So we're paying almost double the local share of our schools, still running a surplus, and have the largest tax cut. It's all in my book. That's Boots and Revolution. You don't have to take notes. Another shameless plug. All right, so that's tax policy. Let's talk about regulations. Streamlining regulations, right? That's another one. You may or may not understand or appreciate or have heard of this before, but there's a thing called an income gap with the top wage earners and the bottom quartiles. And that gap can tend to get pretty wide. And it's not socially healthy to have a big differential between the top and bottom. That separation of classes usually takes you to a bad place. But something you may not have known is that there's a very good correlation between freedom and closing the income gap. People often think capitalism causes the income gap because you got people that get ahead and people are left behind. It turns out that the freedom to make choices has a higher correlation with closing the income gap than anything else. And in this book, I've got the stats and the numbers of all the countries and what their freedom index is and what their income gap is. And that's measured by something called the Gini index, G-I-N-I. It's named after an Italian statistician. It's all in there. But believe me, freedom, the more free you are, the more you're going to close that income gap. A rising tide lifts all boats. Think about it. In the old days, 100 years ago, you had kings and royal families, and they had all the wealth. And folks in their countries didn't have the wealth, right? So you had separation of classes, usually ends poorly. Ask King George. So more freedom closes the gap, and every time you pass a regulation, it's like putting a bar in a cage, and you're less free. So all the regulations build a cage for you, get less and less free. If you want to close the income gap, streamline regulations, take the bars out of the cage, and let people free, and that will close the gap. Another thing, let's go with stable currency, inflation. Anybody feel the effects of inflation?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay, all right. So inflation has winners and losers. One of the winners, well, a couple of the winners are government and the haves. And I'll get into why in just a second, but the losers are the lower income brackets that get absolutely devastated by inflation, and the have-nots. And I'll get into more details on that. So the definition, as we all know, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. Well, how do you get too much money? Well, the government prints money. Well, why do they print money? Well, you're running a budget deficit of $2 trillion. And when you monetize that debt and print enough money to pay for that deficit, you're going to get inflation. Printing money is like a stock split. You all know what a stock split is. You've got GE, IBM, take a company, and if you own 100 shares and they do 2-for-1 split, you get another 100 shares. Now you get 200 shares. Does that mean you doubled your value? No. You get 200 shares, but each worth half as much, right? So if I double the money supply, the cash in your wallet is now worth half. You get twice as much money, but the trick is, of the money that was printed, see, when you do a stock split, everybody has 100 shares, gets 2-for-1, gets another 100 shares. But when they print money, it's not like everybody has $1 in a wallet, gets another $1, right? See how that goes? So it depends on where the stock split money goes to. But that's a deeper dive that I want to get into right now. The haves and have-nots. The haves are people that own a house, own a 401k, have stocks and bonds, and they've seen the price of the house go up, the stocks go up, and they're just getting wealthier. Oh, and by the way, they locked in a fixed rate mortgage when interest rates were near zero. So their liabilities are not going up, but their wages are going up at 10-15% with inflation. Their house value is going up. So the haves are getting happier. They actually have more money than before. The top 20% of this country spends 40% of the consumption. So they're doing just fine. Actually, they're better off with inflation. The have-nots, on the other hand, if you're renting and your rent goes up and you were just making ends meet, you're not getting ahead. You're getting behind. So it actually contributes to that separation of the classes I was talking about. These bad government policies lead to greater income gaps and a separation of classes, which is not sustainable in the long run. Now, I said the government makes out too. How do they make out? Government now has 36 trillion in debt, 36 just crossed this week. 10% inflation devalues that 35 or 36 trillion by 10%, and that's 3.6 trillion. So because they have to pay it back later with cheaper dollars, right? 10% cheaper dollars. So let's say that you owe me 36 trillion. Inflation hits at 10%. Now you just saved 3.6 trillion, but you're running at 1.8 trillion deficit. You're actually better off, right? You're spending 1.8 you don't have, but you're devaluing what you owe by twice that. So you see, so the government actually does pretty well in inflation. And if it's long enough and bad enough, some of that lower bracket that was just making ends meet now gets pushed over the edge. Where do they end up? If you fall off the high wire, you end up in the safety net. And that means we're going to need bigger government programs with more money to take care of more people, right? So anyway, these are some of the winners and losers of inflation. Now, who controls the printing presses and whether we have inflation and the budget deficits and all that? The federal government, who's one of the biggest beneficiaries? The federal government. So I don't know. Anyway, let's talk about fiscal responsibility. Don't spend more than you take in. There you go. How about that one? I know it's quite an insight. You don't have to write that one down. It's easier to put the bumper sticker. Don't spend more than you take in. Balanced budget. But speaking of deficits, the deficit used to be in millions, and then it went to billions, and now it's trillions. And what comes next? Some people say,
Default.
I've heard both the answers, quadrillions and bankruptcy. The trend isn't good, my friends. Look, there are so many more policies. There's not enough time for me to go into all of them, but I will share a caution with you before I wrap up. A couple more comments. In the recent election, this coming January, there'll be a torch that's passed from one administration to another and from one party to another. And the incoming party will basically be a one-party rule, the White House, the House, and the Senate. Americans do not like one-party rule on either end, okay? Because it enables legislation that's not perfectly dead center. It's to one side or the other. And if it goes extreme enough, you have what we just had on November 5th. So 4 years from now, is the current administration, one of the cautions would be, if you overplay your hand, you end up with another transfer of power. So the trick is going to be fixing all the problems, getting all the good work done, but not overplaying your hand, and, as important, delivering good economic outcomes and economic prosperity, because as we all know, it's the economy stupid. So if you want to retain power, a couple of ways to do it is don't overplay your hand and deliver a strong economy while you're fixing all those problems. Does that make sense? And we have more of that? So now you know the playbook going forward. I want to leave you with a couple of teasers from the book. There's a chapter on the moral decline in this country. We've all seen the decline in morals. Speaking of morals, do you all know that Moses was the first one to download a file from the cloud to a tablet? You guys can use that one if you want. It's after lunch. You guys fall asleep. I want to make sure you're still with me. All right. Isms. You know what isms, right? Capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, Marxism, authoritarianism, nationalism, Tea Partyism. You just put an ism on the back of anything, and everybody has an opinion. When I talk to people, what about capitalism? Love it or hate it. What about socialism? Love it or hate it. What about communism? Love it or hate it. Can you define any of those? I won't ask anybody here to give me a clear definition of capitalism, socialism, and communism, and contrast and compare the differences between those systems. But it's all in the book, so you might have to work on it. Now, I was also going to ask if anybody here can name at least 5 signers of the Declaration of Independence. There were 56 to choose from. I'll let you write those down and keep those to yourself. There were 38 signers of the Constitution. You can write 5 of those down too if you want. Or you can just get the... There you go. All right, good. You're still with me. Now, the easiest one, it's all in there, by the way. It's a great resource if you're going to debate somebody about good government. The easiest one was the only person that signed the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and the Treaty of Paris, which ended the U.S. Revolution. Great, we got some scholars here. I was going to ask George, he was there. But good for you to get a gold star. Now another little bit of trivia. You have an American flag somewhere? There's one right here. American flag has a blue field with 50 stars, one for each state. Which one is Virginia? You guys want me to tell you, or you want to read the book? Just tell you. It turns out, I'll spoil over this one. It turns out on the field, there's 50 stars. It goes in the order you admitted to the Union, starting the upper left. First one in is the upper left. And then you count to the right. And by the time you get to number 10, which is Virginia, you'll have found Virginia's star on the flag. Now you all learned something. So thanks for coming. I appreciate that. That's true. That's the most meaningful part of the whole book. Now you don't need to read the book. All right, so what you're going to take away from this is fix all the problems, but don't overplay your hand. Deliver a strong economy. Follow the good government principles and policies. Nail the economy, and elections will take care of themselves. For that, let me just conclude my formal remarks and thank you all for listening. Thanks very much. Do we have time for questions? We cut the personal property tax from 4% down to 2.99%. Well, okay, tax policy, I wasn't gonna expand on this. We cut about a half a dozen different taxes. We cut them on things that we wanted more of. We cut taxes on volunteer firemen. Their first vehicle is tax-free, so they can get to fires and back without paying tax on that vehicle. And we wanted more volunteer firemen. We cut taxes on small businesses. It used to be if your sales were above $10,000, you had to pay a tax for amounts above $10,000 on sales. We raised that to $50,000, so that small businesses, startups can get their sea legs under and get started before you even start to pay any tax. We went down, like I said, about half seniors, disabled vets, and we went down the list and said, what do we really value and what do we want more of? And we cut those taxes.
Real estate taxes?
Real estate is 53. Anybody got one lower than 53 cents on 100? I think it's 53 cents. I think the city's $1.20. I think right there was in the 70s, 80s. That's 50. All right, we got to cut it by 3 then. I'm running for office again. There actually. You know, when you cut taxes, streamline regulations, we didn't talk about streamlining regulations. We also